Well, we are going to start the second panel, Reaching Out to Asia. Is it all about primary commodities? My name is Ariel Harmony, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Miami, and it's a pleasure to be here always. This is sort of second home for me. We are going to move pretty fast. The panelists, I'm sorry, but you guys have 15 minutes, and I have to be cruel in terms of enforcing that. We will start with Marcos Robledo, who is a professor of international relations and Chilean foreign policy at the School of Political Science and a researcher at the Institute of Ciencias Sociales, both at the Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. Marcos.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much to the Wilson Center for the invitation to participate in this seminar. I'm going to also, therefore, to summarize the main points of my draft paper. And the first idea is that it's a point that may seem very basic today, because it's very well known, etc. But I think we have a very long-standing debate in Chile of the type of foreign policy we have been making during the last 20 or more years. And my main argument is that since the beginning, the main rationale of the Chilean foreign policy has been that of democratic consolidation, not trade development, but democratic consolidation. And I think this is important to remember today, because from a democratic perspective, trade relationships must be assessed in terms of the long-term impact of the development of the Chilean democracy. Okay, so I'm going to make some points regarding this issue in the next slides. In this sense, the economic internationalization of Chile was a critical area of foreign policy. I think Richard mentioned some of the Chilean features in this sense. It was a very pragmatic at every level of the international trade relations. And today, Chile has signed 20 FTAs, free trade agreements with 60 states, probably the widest network in the world. And it has meant that a 16 million people country currently is available to access that level of world markets. And more than 60% of the Chilean economy depends on foreign trade and international economic cooperation. In this bigger framework, the Chilean policy toward the Asia Pacific has been a very also more specific but also crucial component. Chile has been also, some people mention, an early pioneer that was able to realize the importance of the Asia-Pacific region, and since then, in the 90s, has been very active in developing economic relations with the countries of that region. Entered APEC in 1994. Since then, has been very vocal supporter of the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, and also has developed a building block strategy. One of the milestones of this strategy was the founding of the P4 in 2006. And also in 2011, it launched together with the other countries, with Peru. It was a Peruvian idea, to be fair, the Pacific Alliance. And currently, Chile has developed a very extensive network of free trade agreement with the Asia-Pacific region, which you can see here. And these trade agreements include India. This is not a free trade agreement, it's a partial trade agreement, but currently is being deepened by bilateral negotiations. Also, my paper has been trying to make an assessment from a Chilean point of view of this policy. So what worked well, as I point there, in this sense? I think this strategy was very successful regarding some dimension of the Chilean development and democratic strategy. As you can see there, the indicators are very well known. These are the positive side of the Chilean process. But also there are some more complicated dimensions that were in some sense also mentioned before. It's not an outcome of a foreign trade policy. It's a problem, it's a wider problem, of course, but inequality in Chile is still too high, probably one of the highest in the world. And more recent data even shows that the 1% of the super rich people in Chile is getting more than 30% of the country income. So that's a very unsustainable situation, and it has sparked the massive students and middle class protests since 2011 in Chile. And secondly, the country is also, it was mentioned also, into the middle income trap. So I think that there are some features in the sustainability of the Chilean foreign policy in the economic dimension that maybe will be more debated in Chile in the next years. One of the shortcomings that I'm trying to highlight is a high level of concentrations. Here is some data. And I would like to highlight, for instance, that not only is concentrated in mining, copper, but also is concentrated in very small number of enterprises. And there is a very, very low participation of SMEs in that process, which says a lot of if you take care of inequality, this kind of lack of diversification maybe says a lot. So this is one type of problem. Second, there is a weak linkage to value chains, which is associated with the previous shortcoming. And it also poses a very important challenge for Chilean exports and the relationship with the Asia Pacific, but not only with the Asia Pacific. I hope we can discuss a little bit more about that, also with Latin America. And also poses a challenge to develop new kind of policies aimed at strengthen SMEs' participation in that kind of efforts. So at the end, I think there must be an increased effort in this sense. If we are going to link more successfully our success in our international insertion from an economical point of view, I think we also have to develop a more aggressive policy, trying to link it with the creation of jobs, with the creation of small enterprises, which is the most direct way to contribute to reducing inequality in the country. In this sense, while there has not been an industrial policy in the Chilean debate since many years, I think it poses the need of open a debate of what kind of industrial policy we should have if we are going to address that. The second part of my presentation is more related to the current negotiations on the region, on the Asia-Pacific region. I think that this negotiation, and particularly the TPP, are frameworked in a more global dynamic, but also in a regional dynamic. And in this negotiation, Chile has been participating because it was one of the founders of the P4. However, the character of the P4 changed dramatically after the entrance of the US and the rest of the countries. In my point of view, it changed from a more symmetrical group to a more like-minded, organized around the new disciplines and standards proposed by the US that are higher than the WTO. And another important feature is that it is open to China, but of course it has been producing a very complex reaction from the other side. So from a Chilean point of view, I think that the current negotiations are developing a more complex reaction from Asia, and I would say also from Latin American countries. Strictly from a national point of view, also the negotiations at the TPP are complex for Chile because Chile has already FTAs agreements with all the TPP countries. So the benefits that the country can obtain are currently more marginal than the rest of the negotiators. This is the table of the agreements, and you can see the red letters where you see that Chile is the only country that has FTAs with all the participants on the TPP. So it has low incentives to negotiate in the way that has been said until now, because it has to adhere to new standards that are very costly for the country, but will not gain any access to market or if you take a look regarding the number of agreements, these are the numbers. Chile has a higher number than the rest of the countries. And also the disciplines that has been covered by the bilateral agreements are also included in the Chilean, the disciplines that are being negotiated at the TPP has been also covered by the Chilean bilateral agreement, especially with the US, which covers all the disciplines. The Chilean-US agreement was entered into force in 2004. So it was a very interesting negotiation because it was more, for a Chilean perspective, was more equitable than the current kind of negotiations at the TPP. And the most sensitive issues are those that are highlighted there. And however, despite that, the Chilean participation in TPP is also interesting because the Japanese entry. Finally, I think that that kind of process in the Asia-Pacific poses very significant questions for the Chilean foreign policy. Because of the importance of the South-South trade that have been discussed before. First, Chile should have to choose between its two main trading partners, China and the U.S. Since a pair of years, China has become the first Chilean trading partner, overtaking the U.S. And also has been stressed the overall regional economic relationship with China and East Asia is changing, and probably this trend will be maintained in the next decades. I think in this sense, it's important to consider these trends developed by in 2007 before the crisis, but probably will keep the trend because most of this increase comes from the emerging economies. So I think it's something to take in consideration. So in my final point are that probably Chile should try to look for a more balanced agreement within the TPP negotiation. Probably the more recent events may be interesting in this sense. I'm talking about the most recent visit of the Chinese president to the US. But also, while this kind of negotiation is not well resolved, I think the country must keep open the possibility to influence with other countries the way the TPP is negotiated until now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcos, very much. The next presentation is by Cynthia Sanborn, who's going to talk about Peru and the Asian connection. Cynthia Sanborn is a director of the Research Center and professor of political science at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima. She has been the director of the program on philanthropy and social change at Harvard University, and also a program officer for the Ford Foundation in New York and Santiago de Chile. And while she gets ready, let me just say that it is a pleasure to be sharing a panel with Cynthia. I've read most or all of her work, and I really admire it, so it's a pleasure to be in the same panel.
Thank you very much, Ariel. I have a paper that is quite long, and I'm going to try and cut to the chase on the issues that perhaps differentiate or are most notable of the Peruvian case. I think a number of things that have been mentioned here today have been repeated over and over, so I'm going to see if I can cut that down a bit. The paper has a lot more for those who want to read it. It introduces some of the challenges and debates in Peru about the relationship with Asia. It discusses some of the historical facts in Peruvian-Asian relations and asks to what extent they're relevant for the situation today. It then talks about trade with Asia and investment by Asia in different Asian countries in Peru, and ends up with some conclusions. The way I start the paper is by stressing what I think all of us know, but some of us even who live in Peru still have a hard time processing, is the enormous success story of Peru in terms of economic and social development in the last 10, 15 years. Peru has had extraordinarily sustained economic growth. It has slashed poverty from 54% to 25%, and has a rising middle class, as Mr. Moreno said this morning. And a good share of that success story is about mineral exports and Peru's ability to respond to Asian and worldwide demand for its assorted mineral products. But it's also about sound economic policy and especially aggressive expansion of trade relations around the world. I think Peru is similar to Chile in that respect. The relationship with Asia has been key, most particularly with China, also Japan and South Korea. The demand for minerals on the part of these countries has been fundamental. Peru as a global mineral exporter has increased significantly since the industry was privatized completely in the early 90s. Over 62% of export values from Peru are now in minerals, in an array of minerals, including copper. And because of this, there's been considerable demand in Peru in the last several presidential elections and in the political agenda about the extent to which the resource curse is coming back, to the extent to which the dependency on large-scale mineral extraction exports is a risk for the economy. And Peruvian policymakers have responded to these concerns in two main ways. One of them, which is what I focus more in my work, is on sort of harvesting the benefits of the mining industry, establishing corresponding to global standards for the industry, encouraging backward and forward linkages, encouraging better corporate behavior, and really taking advantage of Peru's rich mineral resources to fund more longer-term development needs. And the other is about diversification of trade, signing free trade agreements with a wide array of countries, and opening up other sectors of the economy that have been underdeveloped. In both cases, the relationship with Asia is important. In the case of global standards, which is something I mentioned in the paper and in some of the other work I've done, working with Asian firms, particularly Chinese firms in the industry, which are expanding considerably, to comply and even rise above sort of common operating procedures in the mining industry, encourage more Asian investment, a more considerable Asian investment in large and very modern projects that involve relocation, that involve creating of new communities and the sort. In the relationship with free trade, as we mentioned, Peru has signed free trade agreements with at least 5 Asian countries, 18 countries overall. And the paper concludes that the net result of trade diversification efforts has been positive. The net result of relations with Asia and trade has been positive. There's been considerable dynamism, even though over 90% of Peru's exports remained primary products, particularly in the minerals area, also fish meal. The accelerated increase in the non-traditional products area is considerable, and it's not a case of deindustrialization. As Richard said, for the region as a whole, the case of Peru certainly illustrates that both traditional exports and non-traditional exports have increased considerably in recent years. As many of you know, Peru has some of the largest Chinese and Japanese ethnic populations in the world, and certainly in South America. And part of the paper, I really explore some of the relations that begin in the 19th century because they're very important within Peruvian society and culture. And I think as Peru moves forward in deepening its relationship with China and as it has deepened and renovated and reassessed its relationship with Japan over the years, the role of sizable ethnic communities has become more important. In doing business with China today, for example, the Chinese Peruvian population has become incredibly active in terms of going on business trips, encouraging its children to study in China, encouraging reestablishment of relationships with Chinese relatives. And I think the importance of this is brought up and used politically and economically by leaders in both countries, particularly in China, also historically in Japan, to kind of underscore and raise the legitimacy of these relationships within the domestic political and social sphere. That's been very important and widely positive. Peruvian trade with Asia. Peru is an active member of APEC, of Asia Pacific as well. As I mentioned, the free trade, but 92% of Peru's trade, as in the Latin American pattern, is with 3 countries, China, Japan, and South Korea. China became Peru's #1 trading partner within a year of signing the putting the free trade agreement into practice. Peru signed the free trade agreement in 2009. Within a year, China has become Peru's major trading partner. 70% of Peruvian exports go to China. 83% of this is copper, lead, iron, and fish meal. And that sort of the balance between China and the U.S. as Peru's main trading partner really has to do with mineral prices so far. It's really driving that. Imports from China have also escalated in Peru. They've been grown by 30% in the last few years. And the majority of the imports that are coming from China into Peru are going at various levels into industry and intermediate goods used by Peruvian industry, and 17% consumer goods. We look at this in the paper. There's Peru's trade relations. We look at this in the paper and really assess to what extent there's been a negative impact on certain sectors, such as apparel and textiles, footwear. But the overall conclusion is that total trade has increased considerably. The total number of Peruvians exporting to Asia has increased considerably. There's over 500 Peruvian companies operating in China alone today. The number and variety of non-traditional goods has increased considerably and growing fast. Manufactured exports grew 46% to China in the last 3 years since the free trade agreement went into operation, much higher than the world average. trades going on in chemicals and different types of elaborated agricultural products, metallurgical products, and the same. And in the sectors that have been that face more direct Chinese competition, such as textiles, the reaction is also mixed because a good share of the textile sector was left off the agenda in the free trade agreement, was retained some degree of protection in negotiations with China. And the Peruvian textile industry uses a considerable number of inputs from China in the process of elaborating garments. So it's also kind of a mixed bag there. It hasn't collapsed as some might have expected. This is the Latin America pattern and the Peru pattern, which is pretty much the same, what many have mentioned this morning. This is hard to see. It's the penetration of imports from China into the Peruvian market, and we see from 2007, 2010, how that's worked. I've tried to look at sort of Peru's trade with the rest of the world versus Peru's trade with major Asia partners, China, Japan, and Korea. This is in the paper. Peru's, let's go back here. Peru's exports to Asia overall are more in, value of Peru's exports to Asia overall are more in the mineral area than they are to the rest of the world, but also Peru's manufacturing exports to Asia have grown much faster than they have to the rest of the world. So as Richard mentioned in the morning, the Latin American pattern is also the case in Peru. And in the case of minerals, it's really, as I said, about the prices. Production of minerals in Peru has lagged in recent years. That's a source of major concern and major active seeking of new investment from Asia. Whereas the growth of manufacturing products of different types is really about aggressive efforts at trade diversification. It's much more than just the market price pulling them forward. And so that's a positive factor in Peru. In terms of investment, which the paper also looks like, Asian investors remain much less present in Peru than those of the European Union and the United States, as I think is the pattern in most countries. Relationship with Japan was very significant in the 60s and 70s, but because of instability and crisis in Peru, a lot of those opportunities were lost through the 80s, and today Japanese investors are largely minority partners in important mining projects. There are other Japanese enterprises operating in Peru, but Peru lost that opportunity in the 70s and more so in the 80s, and that's the paper tries to draw some lessons from that experience. With South Korea today, the investments are also largely in the mining sector as minority partners with Chinese and other investors. But a free trade agreement with Korea has been about the efforts by the current administration in Peru to aggressively seek other types of relationships with Korea. Agreement has been made for Peru to produce airplanes through a Korean collaboration with Korea and other kinds of industrial technical cooperation. It's an anecdote, but our current president was military attaché in South Korea in the early 2000s and has a very active personal interest in developing more relationships with that country. The paper includes some of the main investments from Japanese companies, especially in mining, Korean companies in mining and fisheries, and the Chinese, which is the story that we've been looking at in some of our other research very importantly. Chinese investment in Peru was almost nil until the early 90s. In 1992, however, China had its first major overseas investment in Latin America in Peru, having purchased Peru's leading iron ore company, Hierro Peru, by the state-owned enterprise Shougang. It was China's first major overseas investment in this region, and it was Peru's very first privatization of the mining industry. So it was a first for both countries in an important way. China also purchased some of Peru's state-owned assets that were sold off in the petroleum industry. But it took 15 more years before China really became a major player in investing in Peru in other opportunities. From 2007 onward, we've seen a boom in Chinese investment in Peru, particularly in mining and hydrocarbons. 3 or 4 of the most important copper projects in Peru today are in the hands of Chinese investment, largely state-owned enterprises, Chinalco, Minmetals, but also some private and mixed capital coming from China. And we've been exploring some of the differences between those on the ground. China today is the 10th most important investor in Peru, well below, as I said, other countries. But it's the single largest investor in the mining industry, And in terms of the portfolio that the Peruvian government manages in the next 5 years, some $56 billion expected in new mining investments, almost a quarter of that is coming from China or expected to come from China. So it's being cultivated as a major player in our mining industry in the years ahead. The paper explores some of the obstacles to Chinese investment efforts in other sectors, including a bid on a port that did not come through, and some, based on interviews and discussion with Chinese diplomats and Chinese business leaders who are increasingly active in Peru and have an interest association that has developed, a number of obstacles are pointed out to doing business in Peru from the perspective of Chinese entrepreneurs and their diplomats. The paper points out that in the early 90s, some of the investments that China made in Peru did not involve due diligence on the part of Chinese of what the context was which they were getting engaged. For example, major mining projects that sort of socially and politically are not going to go forward, and the Chinese really didn't understand that when they first bought into them, and now they're trying hard to sell them off. But that's changed dramatically. The Chinese have really learned, both investors and their diplomatic representatives in Peru have learned considerably how to investigate and check sort of the viability of projects they're investing in before they move in. That's something that's been a big change. The paper points out other obstacles, for example, from relatively minor regulatory, tax, and legal issues that Peru needs to better resolve for Asian investors coming in general, and particularly compatibility with Chinese systems. But it also stresses, and I think this is something that came up in Marcos's presentation as well, beyond signing free trade agreements, beyond negotiating really good terms for a small country like Peru with a big giant like China, Peruvian policymakers and political leaders have really not had that big vision and that attention to what it really takes in terms of public policy to move forward and take better advantage of these opportunities. There's been a somewhat resting on your laurels and letting private initiative flow after the agreements are signed. And what's really been driving trade with Asia so far has been important private initiatives on the part of Peruvian entrepreneurs, much less than sort of coherent and proactive state policy. I look at the paper because this is an issue I work on a lot. The paper looks a bit on this issue of global standards as China and to some extent Korea and other investors, Asian investors, become important in the extractive industries in Peru. There have been a lot of concerns, also a lot of prejudices about to the extent to which the mining industry was going to decline in standards, the extent to which labor, environmental issues were going to be a problem, the extent to which transparency would be a problem. And this is something we really look at because indeed some of the most important projects driving the economy, improving the economy forward in the years ahead will be copper projects owned by China. China may be purchasing additional ones as a result of their objection to the Glencore Xstrata fusion. They've got the right to purchase more copper projects in Peru, access to them. So this is something we really looked at. And what we found is what I mentioned. Very rapid ability to learn from previous mistakes in the 90s, ability to hire good people in Peru to be advised by the lawyers and consulting firms that Western operators have used, and much more aggressive activity on the part of Chinese diplomats to defend their firms. Even minor things such as when a Chinese firm gets bad publicity, their embassy is now right on that, trying to address whether or not that actually is fair and respond to that, encouraging others to take a second look, inviting scholars to visit Chinese operations, something that had been much more difficult in the past. And I guess that the sort of two extreme cases that we look at, one is the case of a project called Rio Blanco on the border with Ecuador, which was sort of the worst case of Chinese not doing due diligence and Peruvian authorities trying to hook them into investing in something that wasn't going to work. And that they're now trying to just sell off. And the other extreme is the case of Chinalco, which I think the whole world has been looking at. They're carrying out the first major voluntary and participatory relocation of an entire city in Peru and probably in South America, entirely funded and managed by a Chinese state-owned enterprise, the city of Morococha. That project is moving forward in a way that's so far extremely impressive. And it's putting to shame a number of other companies in Peru that are going to have to carry out relocations and haven't invested the kind of time and resources that Chinalco is doing so far. And so we look at that in terms of how important it is to China and how important it is to Peru to show that even in this industry, global standards are being complied with. I'll just leave it there. Deep historical ties and new relations. Trade does reinforce Peru's role as a mineral exporter. Most of Peru's trade is in minerals, but it's much more dynamic and interesting in the non-traditional area, and that's growing considerably just in the last 3 years. The free trade agreements have been very important for that because the commodities boom was going to happen with or without them. Peru was going to grow with or without them in the minerals area, but the agreements have really allowed for the development of other opportunities. And the main critiques in the paper are of Peruvian domestic policies or the lack thereof, the resting on your laurels rather than really developing more proactive strategies to help companies move forward across the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, very much. The third presenter is Gonzalo Paz, who's a professor. He teaches at American University and University of Maryland, and he's a former lecturer at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Gonzalo is going to talk about Argentina's growing links with Asia.
Good morning to everybody. Before all, thank you very much to the coordinators of this project, Jorge Heine and Cynthia Arnson, for this really appreciated invitation. The task of analyzing the relations between Argentina and Asia or East Asia, it's a very timely and needed undertaking. Until now, it has not been possible to find much research on the topic, and most scholars will probably agree that these relations are not a well-known chapter of Argentine foreign relations, as little reliable academic research had been done and scarce interest had been shown by the press and related mass media. There are several reasons for the lack of interest in the relations between Argentina and Asia, but the most common is that these relations have been of secondary importance for Argentina, even if such relations have existed for a long time, at least with some countries, and developed quite remarkably during the last decade of the 20th century. Gonzalo, stop. What are you saying about this? This is not the picture that we have about the relations between Argentina and China. Well, exactly a decade ago, in 2003, I was invited by a German university to produce a study about the same topic. And it was supported by the Volkswagen Foundation. And this paragraph is the first part of my report of 10 years ago. So I was really tempted to bring it today to establish a clear base of comparison, to see what so many things have changed in 10 years for Argentina. You cannot recognize Argentina's relation with Asia in this paragraph anymore. So instead of listing the presidential visits, showing you charts with the trade that everybody knows that have exploded between Argentina and Asian countries, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and now India, it's becoming really very important. I have, following a suggestion and a request by Jorge and Cynthia, I have tried to focus more on this deep transformation inside Argentina, on the effects of these relations between Argentina and Asia on Argentina. What happened in Argentina? So few countries in Latin America, if any, have been under a process of transformation like that of Argentina, due in great part to its relationship with East Asia and primarily China in the last decade. The impact is also geophysical. It is quite visible. You see the impact when you travel inside Argentina, both in the countryside, but also, to less extent, in urban areas. The soya complex, el complejo sojero, it's a new, advanced, technologically sophisticated and dynamic economic sector that is at the core of Argentina's relation with China and Asian countries. Here I want to make, so the transformation inside Argentina, it's my main topic in my paper. I will have no time to cover all the points, but you can see it. This is not the last version of the paper. There is a second one, and after the criticism and comments, I hope I will have a better, a refined version. A second important point that I want to stress now is that, you know, countries in Latin America have been classified in different ways. Manufacturer exporters like Mexico, Brazil, being a mixed case of manufacturer exporter, but also and commodity exporter, Argentina commodity exporter, Chile and others. Richard came with a very nice classification this morning. I would like to stress the point that soybean, it's not a normal commodity as we are talking. It's kind of different commodity. When we talk about this commodity lottery that have benefits some countries in Latin America and not others, I want to stress that the soybean sector was a sector that it doesn't exist in Argentina 15 years ago. So this is a major transformation. This is a capability that the country have to some extent reinvent itself in order to catch with the economic growth in Asia and to take opportunities of this growth in order to re-engineer its own process of economic growth. So many people have stressed the fact that the amazing recovery of Argentina after a major crisis in 2001 was due to the trade with Asia, particularly with China. This point has been stressed several opportunities. But I would like to broaden the scope of this comment and saying that the most important narrative in Argentina, when I teach courses about Argentina, trying to make sense of the Argentine experience in the 20th century, is the experience of the decline of Argentina. Argentina used to be 50% of the total GDP of Latin America at the beginning of the 19th century. And so when you try to make sense of Argentina, when you try to understand Argentina, you have to understand this long, protracted process of decline. So this new engagement with Asia, this economic growth that Argentina have had during the last 10 years or so, growing at a rate of approximately 8% on average every year, you had to put it in the context of the explanation of understanding if this is a breaking point in this long process of declining of Argentina after Second World War, in which more markets in the world had been closed for the kind of production of Argentina until this new century, in which a new demand have emerged in Asia, in China, in Asia, and so with the same conditions of protectionism in the agriculture sector still prevailing in world markets, but now there are demand for the kind of production that Argentina can excel. I don't want to enter in the details of the Complejo Sojero, the soybean sector, but it's a quite important sector. You know, I didn't knew anything about this 15 years ago. Now I am a student of it. You know, soybeans, it's one of the most important sources of vegetable protein in the world. It's the most important feed for animals in the world. Fish, chicken, and pork all are fed with soy milk, which is a subproduct of crushing the soybeans. The soybean have 18% of oil, and the oil of this soybean is the most important vegetable oil in the world. And more recently, in the last 5 years a new sector have emerged in the field of energy. The issue of energy security and food security is pushing and pressing the demand for soybean and for corn, all the kind of stuff that Argentina is very competitive producing. The technology gap between Argentina and the United States, which is the most sophisticated agricultural sector in the world, is just 6 months. So it's an amazing, very productive sector. So the political implications of this change, this inside transformation of Argentina are really very important. it's very difficult to understand how the current government of the Kirchner have been able to remain in power for 10 years, winning the elections in 2005, the midterms election, the presidential election in 2007, lost in the election in 2009. We'll talk about this in a moment. Winning the presidential election in 2011 without understanding the importance of this sector and how the government, in order to emerge of the crisis of 2001, the government of Dualde put a tariff of 20% on the export of soybeans and other agricultural stuff that had been raised to 35%. And an important moment of this last decade happened in the year 2008, in March of 2008, when the government tried to raise again this tariff from 35% to 42%. And then in a crisis that took 128 days from April to June of 2008, the government suffered the most important political defeat on the history. And they lost the following election, midterms election in 2009. So we have been discussing about the impact of reprimarization and of focusing too much on the exports of primary products and understanding the potential of damage of this competition of imports from China and from other Asian countries to the countries that have a manufacturing sector, such as Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. A very important difference in the case of Argentina is that you have the CGT, the union labors, and you have the Peronism. And this has been a very important barrier. If you understand this, you understand the second very important date in the last decade in the relations between Argentina and Asia, and that is the trade crisis between China and Argentina in April of 2010, which is the most important trade crisis between a Latin American country and Asian country in decades. In this moment, China stopped buying soybean oil, and this caused a major, even political crisis between both countries. And the reason, there were several reasons. I have established several hypotheses, 4 hypotheses. You can find them in my paper. But basically, China retaliated because of the many protectionist measures that it have adopted vis-a-vis China. And these cannot be explained just in economic terms, but because of the pressure of this constituency of the current government, the CGT and the Peronism. So this is a quite important part. So you have 2 new political coalitions in Argentina, putting pressure on the government and changing the political and economic dynamic of the country. I have presented as a brief report about different sectors in which you can trace the evolution of this impact. In the oil sector, page 15 and 16, mining sector 16 to 18, railway sector, which is very, very important, very sensitive for the government. There have been several big crashes, railway crashes in Argentina, and there have been a lot of pressure against the government because of the lack of modernization of this sector. And so the government is renationalizing the railways that have been put in private hands during the 90s. And the Chinese companies are engaged in the process of modernization of the railways. So you see the reinforcements of this infrastructure, but also that have a direct political effect for the government. And financial cooperation that has been also quite important as a country, but also China operating financially inside Argentina. Argentina bought the Standard, China bought the Standard Bank in 2011. The transaction was approved in November of 2012. When you engage in a very intensive way with others, you cannot emerge as you was. You became transformed by the process of engaging, of interacting with others. This is a quite important observation in the case of Argentina. It's a political economy case text. So the transformation has been really very important. This possibility of ending this cycle of the commodities to some extent happened in Argentina in 2010, when China stopped buying the oil. But it was able to survive. It was able to survive because other countries stepped buying the production of Argentina, as Jorge Heine had mentioned. I was in a meeting with the ambassador of India precisely the same day that India decided to buy all this oil that China have refusing to buy because of the sanctions. So the impact of this crisis, that everybody believed that it was really threatening to the economic health of Argentina, was at the end of the day relatively mild. In this overarching narrative in Argentina about the decline, the historical decline after Second World War, there have been several sectors saying that there is a deja vu of the new relationships of Argentina with Asia, with the old pattern of, very successful pattern of relations between Argentina and the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. So if you look about continuity, or if you look about change, you can find both in the case of Argentina, because there is a resemblance, of course, between this new pattern of trade and the old pattern that was so important for Argentina at the beginning of the 20th century. But at the same time, it's a completely different sector that it had been created from nothing. There is this possibility for having other biocommodities that can also be important in the future. I remember an interview I did with Gustavo Grobocopatel, which is called the king of soybean, the most important agribusiness person in South America probably, and he forecasted to me in a meeting in October of 2011 that pulse, garbanzos and lentils can be the next new commodity for Argentina, and he forecasted that maybe in 10 years India could be easily the new China for Argentina. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for the three presentations. These are very interesting, really, really good papers. And I'm going to take exactly 12 minutes to make some brief comments. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight three elements of each of the papers. And the rationale for selecting these elements, these issues, is that I think that one of the interesting things about this meeting is that it allows us to start thinking beyond the description of the relationship between Asia and Latin America, and to start thinking about deeper issues and more conceptual analysis and also the development of research agendas. In the paper on Chile, Marcos Robledo highlights what is a very important element, which is the development on the part of Chile of a multilateralism from Latin America. This is a very original, as he points out, a very original element in Chile's international political economy, in which the country has advanced bilateral, sub-regional, regional, and multilateral trade agreements, and has worked on the concept of building blocks. In many ways, the Chilean strategy in this regard reminds me of a Confucian saying, which, with my bad tones, is "Duo ga pongyo, duo tiao lu." One more friend, one more way, and this describes very well the Chilean approach. More is better, and this creates more opportunities. And I think that this is a very interesting element to explore. That is, the different varieties of multilateralism that countries in Latin America are advancing. The second element has to do with the fact that at the same time, he points out in a very bright way that the network of FTAs that Chile has developed doesn't replace policies of development. And this is another very important element, particularly in light of the question that was discussed earlier of inequality and the serious problems that we see in many Latin American countries, and particularly in Chile. I just came back from China last night, so for me it's 11:20 p.m. And I have many friends in universities. I spend a significant amount of time in universities, and there is a lot of discontent, particularly among students in China, and we know what happened with the students in Chile, and this has to do with the fact that their families invest in education and they are not seeing employment. So this is another very interesting element that also yields to possible interesting comparisons between Latin America and Asian countries. And the third one is what I think one of the most fascinating topics that I see emerging when we look at this issue, which is the simultaneous weakening of the idea of inter-American identity, and at the same time the emergence of a new narrative that comes as a result of this pivot to the Pacific. And I think that this is extremely interesting, and Marcos does a very good job highlighting this element. That is, I don't need to talk about the crisis today in terms of in the OAS, in the inter-American regimes, and how at the same time that we are having this situation, we see several interesting developments in terms of the emergence of a new Latin American identity with UNASUR, CELAC, etc. And at the same time, this I don't want to push the idea of this Pacific Latin America and Atlantic Latin America, which I think is interesting, but I think that it is much more interesting to start thinking about the definition of new geographic areas and the idea of a Pacific Americas and this new flow of not only goods and money, but we also see illegal networks. There is a lot of human trafficking. There are a number of phenomena in the definition of this new geographic area that I think is very interesting. So these are three elements that I want to highlight from this paper. The paper by Cynthia Sanborn on Peru is also very interesting, and there are the elements I want to mention here are the following. First, her emphasis on FTAs as mechanisms that create new business opportunities, how FTAs in Peru are creating a new dynamism. When one talks to high-level officials in Peru, and particularly those who negotiated the FTA with China, etc., always the model is the United States initially. That is where they learn, and this emergence of new FTAs is creating a very interesting scenario for Peru. But at the same time, as she highlights, the commodity boom is independent from the FTAs. And so therefore we need to look at these two elements, of course, in relationship to each other, but also we need to understand that if we try to look at processes of diversification, we need to see how the commodity boom operates and how the FTAs operate, and these may be two separate elements. And finally, the third element is that it is very interesting to see her analysis that China's landing in Peru, in fact, in some sectors created a better access to intermediate goods. And therefore, this is a very interesting challenge to the idea that the arrival of China in countries like Peru is necessarily damaging. That is, what she argues is that firms that are not competing with Chinese products are able to benefit from imports of intermediate goods and therefore lower prices, and that has resulted in a capacity to increase their exports. The question is to what extent this is going to be a trend and whether this is going to be also something that we see in other countries. Finally, the paper by Gonzalo Paz on Argentina. I think that there are three interesting elements to highlight here. The first one is this very important element of soya or soybean as a new product. I think that this is extremely interesting to look at this commodity from the perspective that it is an acquired and it's a highly advanced commodity. And this has very important implications in terms of the way in which we look at this commodity. A second and related element is that, well, yes, he says that it is completely true that 15 years ago there was nothing like the soya, el complejo sojero that we see today. And 15 years ago there was also something that didn't exist, which was the Kirchnerismo. And so it is really interesting because, as you know, a few weeks ago, we were all talking, at least those of us interested in Argentina, about the 10 years of the Kirchners, and there were big celebrations in Argentina. And I happened to be in several TV programs, etc., talking about that. And it's interesting that no one talks about the soybean. And I think that we can write the history of the 10 years of Kirchnerismo from the perspective of soja. And this is a very, very interesting way of looking at the developments in Argentina in the last 10 years. And finally, there is something that it's in the paper and it's extremely important and has to do with ideology. And this is mainly about China. And this has to do with the attempt by President Nestor Kirchner to get the money from China to pay for Argentina's external debt with the IMF. And his idea, as Gonzalo explains, that, well, China would help Argentina liberate itself from the IMF. That is, this notion that there could be a convergence, an ideological convergence with China, and China was not interested in this. And so this is another interesting element that when we talk about strategic partnership with China, we really don't know what we are talking about. The Chinese know somewhat what they are talking about. We Latin Americans don't really know. And well, when it comes to be concrete about certain things, we have important differences in ideology when we think that actually we are all part of this new global south that is trying to sort of liberate itself from some constraints that are historical. I have 1 minute, so I will allow myself to say just two more things. I think that it is very important to look at the Pacific Alliance and TPP in beyond the question of trade and beyond the question of the economy. And there are two elements. I think that the Pacific Alliance is important in terms of its potential for improving state capacity in these countries. And second, one element that I want to highlight about TPP is its relevance for democracy. TPP is discussing issues that are very 21st century issues, IP, state-owned enterprises, disputes between states and multinational corporations. These are very important topics. And these are very important topics that impact citizens, and they are being discussed with very little input from citizens and civil society. So does this impact democracy? Does this impact the democracies that we have in the 21st century? I think that probably it does. So we need to pay attention to this. So now I would like to open the floor for questions. We'll take 3-4 questions. Yes, second, and let's take these 4 questions. Yes.
Hello, my name is Jessie. I'm a research associate at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. And my question is in relation to, you've talked a little bit about the politics of trade on a domestic level, but how trade between Asian and Latin American partners affects international politics at existing organizations such as the World Bank and United Nations, and if the economic relations between Latin American, Asian countries affects how they interact there on economic and political and social issues. Thank you.
Okay, next to you there is a question, and then we'll go there.
My name is Eric Johnson, and I work with the China-Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. And my question involves, when reflecting upon the economic rise of Asia, a lot of people see the benefits derived from Japan as the leader. And I was wondering if you could comment on the necessity of having a leader in Latin America, and if it's necessary, then especially given that all of you spoke about different countries, who do you see as taking the reins? Thank you.
Ambassador Portales.
Thank you. Carlos Portales, American University. Common question. First of all, I think that one thing that has not been explored is the ability of Latin America, has been mentioned but not explored, the ability of Latin American strategy and actors to take advantage of this relation. We have seen this relationship more as the result of a trend, of a demand from Asia, and also from some activity that has been done by a state, which is the establishment of FTAA. But we have another problem. We have to have, to take advantage from a Latin American point of view, we need entrepreneurs and people that make relationships. We had in Chile the experience of the state creating a foundation which was called the Fundación Chilena del Pacífico, which is, well, a private public venture financed by the state mainly. The question is, how could be a private strategy to take advantage of that, and if that exists some sort of idea in countries and in Latin America. The second thing will be the question of, I think we have to be careful in identifying interests, and interests are not just Asia and Latin America or North and South, but we have very different. I think the point that made by Ariel was very important in the sense that, well, Kirchner thought that China was going to supply with the money, and that was not happen. So there are Chinese interests, there are interests in several countries of Latin America, and there are several ways in which Latin American countries are dealing with Asia. Some prefer a bilateral way. You have to see that Latin America has an established relation with Europe through CELAC. South America has established relation with Africa and Arab countries through UNASUR. But we don't have one set of relationship between Latin America and Asia Pacific. CELAC has established some very loose, but there is no such a good dialogue between Asia and Latin America. We have several institutions. And that reflects different interests. And I think one has to take into account this in the future. Finally, in terms of rules and rule setting, which is the main purpose of the TPP, I think we have to differentiate between different type of rules. Because if we were trying to connect what is going to be the demand in Latin America, for instance, labor and environmental standards would be very positive from some point of view. Others say no, but that has to do with local demand, where subject like intellectual property or digital rules could be more problematic. And I think that we have to make difference. But we cannot classify all the type of rules that are going to be set in international trade as the same, and probably we will have different set of actors supporting some rules and others. Thank you.
Thank you, and we have a final question here.
Yeah, my name is Tom O'Keefe from the Foreign Service Institute. I have a very quick question for Marcos Robledo. I wanted to find out if this pattern that you have pointed out of a very small number of firms and very few SMEs taking advantage of exports to Asia is also replicated in terms of Chile's exports to Europe, to the United States, and particularly to the rest of Latin America.
I will ask you to respond very briefly because we need to move to the next panel. Yes.
I can try to do something very briefly. The first question about some political consequences in terms of foreign policy and international relations of this strong economic relationship. I have done a comparison of voting patterns in United Nations from 2000 to 2010, and I have found that there was no change at all in the voting pattern of Argentina, which is the case I am addressing today, because probably of this failure of establish this ideological connection that Ariel was mentioned. So there was no change in the voting pattern in United Nations General Assembly. About the second question that I think is connected with the third one, there is a total lack of collective negotiation in Latin America with any Asian partner. And this is a weakness, this institutional lack of capability for doing this negotiation together. It's a huge problem. Brazil being a member of the BRICS, it's doing as they want, and really all the countries are by themselves. There have been an instance of multilateral collaboration, that is the FOCALAE of FIALAC, that have been a very inefficient multilateral organization. It have never taken off. It's not a substitution for a full engagement in this level, but I think that it's very much needed. Thank you.
Cynthia?
Okay. To the first question, I can't answer as much, except to say that in the Peruvian case, the fact that it's had long-standing relationships with China and other Asian countries has not, as far as I can tell, affected its voting patterns in the United Nations, particularly on issues related to sensitive issues like human rights and democracy, in which Peru has systematically been enthusiastically in favor of all initiatives related to rights across the board, and hasn't affected its relationship with China or vice versa. The question about whether a leader in Latin America is possible or necessary, at least from the perspective of Peruvians, no. And it's hard to imagine who that would be, given, as Carlos and others have said, there are significant differences in the interests or priorities in different countries. The discussion around the TPP per se is one example of that. Even for two countries as close as Chile and Peru, Chile, the TPP could be seen as problematic or not very priority, given the role of state-owned enterprises. In Peru, there are no state enterprises to speak of, and Peruvians are enthusiastic about the TPP. So to think of one leader seems unrealistic. I do think it's important, as was mentioned, that working with these multilateral spaces, and to the extent that they complement or reinforce or improve on the bilateral agreements, is important. But I see it as more of a collective moving forward in different spaces depending on different interests than some kind of single leader. Who would that be? And that relates also to Carlos Portales' question about strategy within countries. And I fully agree. And I think the story here in Peru, as was also mentioned in the Chile paper, and in some work that's being done comparing the impact of the FTAs in both countries, really, as well as my work on sort of governance of the natural resource sector, really points to the need to do more work at home and to do important investment and promotion of infrastructure. I mean, there's serious infrastructure, energy, and physical infrastructure needs to respond to these opportunities. in the area of education, training, scientific and technological development, et cetera, the agenda is really deep. In the case of Peru, I would say that in comparing the Garcia administration with the current Humala administration, the Garcia administration was really about getting those trade agreements and pushing that investment. And in fact, there was a lot of, might say, even irresponsible promoting investment in all kinds of projects that weren't necessarily clear how complicated they were. The Humala administration has been much more concerned about signing agreements for technological and scientific cooperation, education, training, really moving into that other set of areas in which engagement with Korea, Japan, as well as China can be important. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Marcos, 1 minute, one final comment, please.
Thank you very much. I think that the main, there are several issues involving the current trade debate and international political debate, which are linked in the region right now. One, the wider is that the TPP and the way that it's being negotiated, I think despite its initial beginning, maybe could be an opportunity to have a debate on how to create how to create or debate or negotiate
We can hear what's being said there. Can you tell them we've been? Who is that?
Ariel, can you say to the mic?
Who is that?
Say to Mauricio.
Mauricio, pueden hacer silencio así podemos terminar, porque los estamos escuchando.
Sorry.
Gracias.
I didn't know that
Gracias.
you were listening to us. Please go ahead.
Marcos.
Thank you. Thank you, Mauricio. Sí, está bien. What I was trying to stress is that first, there is a chance, despite the way the TPP began, to develop a more asymmetrical conversation between the TPP members, but also between Latin America and the US regarding the new rules for international trade. The way the TPP has begun has been, from a US perspective, setting a standard from a US perspective with a like-minded group of countries, but it is being clear in my point of view that it will be needed some kind of a negotiation to make it successful. So I think it's opening an opportunity for Latin American countries that are participating there to take a different stance, more open to dialogue, not to reject the negotiation, but to be able to put their points of view into the table. I don't know what is going to be the outcome, but I think this is very important. Second, I think this is very important also because as many persons have stressed here, the economic relationship between Latin America and Asia is growing. It is true that there are currently different strategies regarding Asia between different group of countries. But I think that in the end, the challenge for both group of countries in the region is how to improve their relationship with Asia Pacific. And I think it poses the demand for better increased coordination between Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, especially. And I think that it's also important to the future of the Southern American integration, because, and this is related to your question regarding SMEs, because while Asia is currently important for big business and big companies, Latin America is the most important region for SMEs exports. They are more concentrated in Latin America and more successful and competitive in Latin America. So I think this is very important for the region to keep open a dialogue and to develop a process of coordination between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur that is still, that hasn't been, that hasn't begun yet in the region regarding the relationship with the Asia Pacific and the TPP. Last but not least, I think it's important to remember that last year the Chinese Prime Minister went to Argentina and to Brazil and Chile and proposed an FTA with Mercosur.
Mm.
And there has been no response from South America to China. So I think this is my personal view. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.
Sí.